On January 10, 1901, a single well 4 miles south of Beaumont, Texas, produced more oil in one day than every other oil well in the United States combined. Within a year, that torrent of crude had driven the price of oil to 3 cents a barrel, so low that a cup of drinking water in Beaumont cost more. The most valuable substance on earth had become cheaper than what you washed your hands with, and it happened because the earth gave one small Texas town more of it than the world knew what to do with. The hill that did this barely qualifies as a hill. Spindletop rises maybe 12 feet above the flat Gulf Coast prairie, a salt dome pushing gently upward through the clay, noticeable mainly because southeast Texas is so flat that any change in elevation draws attention. Locals called it Big Hill or Sour Springs Mound on account of the sulfur gas that bubbled up from the ground around it, leaving a rotten egg stink and a yellowish residue on the standing water. If you lit a match near certain spots, the gas would catch and burn blue for a moment before flickering out. Nobody was sure what to make of it. The cattle that grazed the pasture land around the hill didn't seem to mind. The ranching families who owned the land, the McFaddens, the Weises, the Kyles, had been running cattle here since before the Civil War, and the sulfur springs were just another odd feature of the landscape, like the mosquitoes and the humidity. Beaumont itself, in the 1890s, was a respectable but unremarkable town of about 9,000 people on the west bank of the Neches River. It had been formally established on December 16, 1838, named for Mary Duberly Barlas Warren Beaumont, the wife of its founder, Henry Millard, a New York-born businessman who'd bought 50 acres from a settler named Noah Tevis and laid out a town site. For most of the 19th century, Beaumont made its living from what the land and the river gave it: lumber from the East Texas pine forests, rice from the coastal lowlands, cattle from the McFadden ranches, and shipping through its river port. The lumber industry had been the city's great engine after the Civil War. East Texas yellow pine floated down the Neches to Beaumont's sawmills, and from there it shipped out by rail and river to supply the reconstruction and expansion of railroads across the South and West. By the 1890s, 5 railroad lines ran through town, including the Southern Pacific, which connected Beaumont to Houston to the west and New Orleans to the east. The first commercially successful rice mill in Texas was operating there, opened by Joseph Eloy Broussard in 1892, and the McFadden family had built canal and irrigation systems capable of watering 18,000 acres of rice country. It was a working town, a prosperous one even, with its own opera house and a respectable commercial district along Crockett Street. But it was not a town that anyone 100 miles away thought much about. The man who changed that was, on the surface, the last person you'd pick for the role. Pattillo Higgins was born in 1863 in Sabine Pass and moved to Beaumont with his family when he was 6. He dropped out of school after the 4th grade to apprentice as a gunsmith under his father. As a teenager, he was known around town as Bud, a drinker, a brawler, a gambler, and a practical joker who ran with a rough crowd. At 17, during an altercation at a Black Baptist church he'd been harassing, a sheriff's deputy shot at him. Higgins shot back and killed the man. His left arm was so badly wounded it had to be amputated. A jury acquitted him on self-defense grounds, and he spent the next few years working as a one-armed logger in the camps along the Texas-Louisiana border. Then, in 1885, something shifted. Higgins attended a Baptist revival meeting in Beaumont conducted by a towering Confederate veteran named Reverend William Penn, a man described as 250 pounds, gray-bearded, draped in a black frock coat. Whatever Penn said that night rewired something in Pattillo Higgins. He converted on the spot. He gave up drinking, gambling, and fighting. He came back to Beaumont and started a brick manufacturing business. And it was the brick business, of all things, that led him to oil. Making bricks requires fuel to fire the kilns. Higgins traveled to manufacturing operations in the Northeast, including visits to Pennsylvania oil country, where he studied geology on his own and learned to recognize the signs of underground petroleum deposits. When he came home to southeast Texas and looked at the little sulfur-smelling hills south of town, the place where he sometimes took his Baptist Sunday school class for picnics, he didn't see a cattle pasture. He saw gas seepage. He saw the indicators he'd read about. He saw an oil field. In 1892, Higgins persuaded several Beaumont businessmen, George W. O'Brien, who had noticed oil seepage on the hill as far back as 1865, along with George W. Carroll, Emma E. John, and J. F. Lanier, to join him in forming the Gladys City Oil, Gas, and Manufacturing Company. He named it after Gladys Bingham, a girl in his Sunday school class, but the name carried a larger vision. Higgins didn't just want to drill for oil. He wanted to build an industrial utopia, a planned city powered by cheap petroleum, with factories and homes and stores laid out around the wells. He drew detailed maps of this imagined city, every block designated, every lot accounted for. He saw oil wells and glass factories and brickworks and a community of workers living in tidy houses. The land around the hill was going for $6 an acre, and Higgins grabbed as much of it as he could. He was utterly convinced. The earth, however, was not cooperating. The Gladys City Company drilled its first well in 1893, dry hole. They tried again in 1895, dry hole. Another attempt in 1896, dry hole. Each failure cost money the investors could ill afford and eroded what little faith they'd had. Beaumont began to regard Pattillo Higgins the way small towns regard obsessives who won't quit, with a mixture of pity and amusement. They started calling him the millionaire, not because he had money, but because he kept insisting the fortune was right there underfoot. The professional geologists of the day were no kinder. The consensus at the United States Geological Survey was that the Gulf Coast of Texas held no significant oil reserves. Higgins, a one-armed brickmaker with a fourth-grade education, was arguing with credentialed scientists and losing. He left the Gladys City Company around 1895, but he didn't stop. He took out advertisements in trade journals and industrial magazines, looking for anyone with the expertise and the capital to drill deeper. Most people ignored the ads. One man didn't. Anthony F. Lucas, born Antun Lucic in Split, Dalmatia, in 1855, the son of a shipbuilder, had been educated as a mining engineer at the Polytechnic Institute in Graz, Austria, served as a second lieutenant in the Austro-Hungarian Navy, and then emigrated to the United States, where he worked in sawmills, in salt mines, and eventually developed an expertise in salt dome geology that was practically unmatched in the country. He was methodical, patient, and possessed the kind of quiet certainty that investors trusted. He'd been studying Gulf Coast salt formations and had come to believe, independently of Higgins, that oil might be found in association with them. When he saw Higgins's ad, he came to Beaumont. In June 1899, Lucas negotiated a lease with the Gladys City Company and a separate agreement with Higgins, and began drilling on Spindletop Hill. His light equipment got down 575 feet before it collapsed in the unstable sands. The money ran out. Lucas went looking for backers. He contacted two experienced oilmen in Pittsburgh, John H. Gailey and James M. Guffey. Guffey had connections to one of the wealthiest families in the country, the Mellons. Andrew Mellon agreed to finance the venture, and the Guffey Petroleum Company was formed. The deal was harsh. Guffey took 5/8, Gailey took 1/4, Lucas kept 1/8, and Pattillo Higgins, the man who had started the entire thing, who had been ridiculed for a decade, who had conceived of the company and the city and the well, got nothing. He was cut out entirely. One of the conditions of the new financing arrangement was that Higgins would have no share in the venture. Lucas, now properly funded, hired the Hamill brothers, Al, Kurt, and Jim, experienced drillers from Corsicana, Texas, where small-scale oil production had begun a few years earlier. Al Hamill, at 26, was the crew chief. Lucas insisted on using rotary drilling with heavy drilling mud to manage the treacherous oil sands, an approach that was innovative at the time and would later become industry standard. They spudded the well on October 27, 1900, on a tract leased from the McFadden-Weiss-Kyle interests, land that abutted the Gladys City Company's holdings. It was cattle pasture, flat and unremarkable, smelling faintly of sulfur. The nearest building was a farmhouse. The nearest city was Beaumont, 4 miles north, population 9,000, where most people thought the whole project was probably another fool's errand. For more than 2 months, Lucas and the Hamills fought the hole. The sands were unstable, the pressure unpredictable, the equipment strained. Twice the hole caved in. They mixed the heavy drilling mud by hand to seal the walls of the well bore. a technique so effective that it became the basis for modern drilling practice. By early January 1901, they'd reached 1,139 feet. On the morning of January 10th, a Thursday, cool and overcast, the Hamels were trying to free a drill bit that had wedged in a crevice. Mud began bubbling from the well bore. Then it began to rise. The Roughnecks barely had time to back away before 6 tons of 4-inch steel drilling pipe shot out of the ground like a javelin hurled by something deep inside the earth. The pipe crashed back down, bending and scattering across the muddy pasture. A moment of eerie silence. Then mud erupted, then gas, and then a column of crude oil, black as midnight, roared out of the hole and into the sky, rising more than 100 feet above the top of the wooden derrick, higher than any building in Beaumont, higher than anything most of these men had ever seen move that fast. It was 10:30 in the morning. The sound could be heard for miles. A low roar, almost industrial, as if the earth had opened its own factory. The oil rained back down in a fine black mist that coated everything: the derrick, the ground, the men who ran from it, the cattle who stampeded from it. The flow was estimated at somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 barrels per day. Nobody had ever seen anything remotely like it. The largest well in Pennsylvania, the previous benchmark for American oil, had produced maybe 50 barrels a day. This was producing 1,000 times that. It took 9 days to cap it, 9 days during which an estimated 900,000 barrels of crude oil poured out of Spindletop Hill and pooled on the surrounding pasture land in lakes of black petroleum, filling ditches and depressions and running toward the Neches. During those 9 days, the world changed. Word traveled by telegraph and then by word of mouth with the speed of rumor and the weight of fact. Within 72 hours, Beaumont's population began its transformation. People came by train. The Southern Pacific Depot became the busiest spot in town, and they came by horse and wagon and on foot. Oilmen, speculators, investors, con men, prostitutes, lawyers, engineers, roughnecks, reporters, real estate hustlers, and people who had no idea what they were going to do but wanted to be near the money. The town's 3 hotels, the Crosby House, the Callahan, and the Beaumont House, all within whistling distance of the railroad depot, filled instantly and stayed full. Newcomers rented chairs and hotel lobbies to sleep in for whatever the hotel keepers charged. They slept in parks, in livery stables, on the wooden sidewalks along Crockett Street. Private homes took in boarders. Tents went up on vacant lots. By March 1901, the population had tripled from 9,000 to 30,000. Eventually, it would reach 50,000. The Crosby House, the best of the 3 hotels, became an informal exchange floor where deals were cut in the lobby, the dining room, and the hallways. Local residents, overwhelmed by the chaos, organized the Beaumont Oil Exchange and Board of Trade to try to impose some order and separate the legitimate operators from the outright criminals. Over 500 oil and land companies incorporated in the area within a year of the gusher, and a majority of them, by most honest accounts, were either underfinanced or fraudulent. The land speculation was staggering, even by the standards of American booms. One man who had been trying to sell a tract near Spindletop for $150, trying for 3 years with no takers, sold it for $20,000 the week after the gusher. The buyer turned around and sold it within 15 minutes for $50,000. A well that represented an initial drilling investment of under $10,000 changed hands for $1.25 million. By the end of 1901, an estimated $235 million had been invested in Texas oil, a figure that in today's terms would run well into the billions. Some of those investors made fortunes that lasted generations. Many lost everything. The companies that came out of this chaos would become some of the largest corporations in the history of the world, and their origins were remarkably scrappy. Joseph S. Cullinan, a former Standard Oil field worker from Pennsylvania whom people called Buckskin Joe, arrived in Beaumont and saw not a gusher, but a logistics problem. Someone needed to buy, transport, and refine all this crude. With Arnold Schlate, a New York investment manager, he formed the Texas Fuel Company in 1901 with an initial capitalization of $50,000. They set up their first office in a wood frame building on Laurel Street, a road so muddy that one employee described the stretch between the front door and the Southern Pacific tracks a few feet away as the worst kind of a mud hole. The entire office staff was 7 people. By 1902, They'd reorganized as the Texas Company, raised $3 million in capital from backers including John W., bet $1 million Gates, a speculator famous enough for his nickname to precede him, and begun building a refinery at nearby Port Arthur. The Texas Company would eventually become Texaco, adopting its red star emblem in 1903 and becoming the first oil company to sell gasoline in all 48 contiguous states by 1928. James Guffey's company, backed by Andrew Mellon's money, would reorganize in 1907 as the Gulf Oil Corporation. Humble Oil, founded a few years later in the region's expanding oil patch, would become part of Standard Oil of New Jersey, Exxon. Magnolia Petroleum set up its refinery on the banks of the Neches in 1903. By 1980, it was Mobil's largest manufacturing plant in the world. There is a particular irony in the fact that Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller's monopoly, the most powerful corporation in America at the time, was largely shut out of the Spindletop bonanza. Texas antitrust laws prevented Standard from moving aggressively into the new field, which gave the upstart companies room to grow and compete in ways that would have been impossible in the East. The very event that created Texaco and Gulf and Humble also weakened the monopoly that might have swallowed them, and Lucas himself, the man who drilled the well, he'd retained only 1/8 of the venture. When Guffey's company reorganized, Lucas found his position diminished further. By the end of 1901, he had left the company. He went to Mexico, then served as a consulting engineer in Russia, Romania, and various American fields. He died of a heart attack in Washington, D.C. on September 2, 1921, at 66 years old. Respected in the engineering profession, but far from wealthy, the man who had opened the Earth's greatest gusher, owning only a small fraction of what it produced. Meanwhile, the sheer volume of production created a problem nobody had anticipated. Oil was so abundant that the market couldn't absorb it. In 1902, Spindletop alone produced more than 17 million barrels, 94% of all the oil produced in the state of Texas. The price of crude collapsed from roughly $2 a barrel to, at its lowest, 3 cents. Water in Beaumont sold for a nickel a cup. The commodity that had attracted 50,000 fortune seekers was, in the most literal economic sense, almost worthless. Companies scrambled to find new markets. Railroads that had burned coal were offered oil at prices too low to refuse, and steamship lines, sugar refineries, breweries, anything that needed cheap fuel, were flooded with offers. The companies also, almost as an afterthought, sold small quantities of refined gasoline to the tiny number of Americans who owned automobiles. The first U.S. auto show had been held in New York City just 2 months before the Lucas Gusher. Nobody at Spindletop knew it yet, but the cheap petroleum pouring out of the ground would make the automobile possible not as a rich man's novelty, but as the defining technology of the 20th century. The historian Daniel Yergin would later argue that Spindletop didn't just discover oil. It made oil cheap enough to build a civilization around. The overproduction was also the first signal that the boom had a ceiling. By 1904, Spindletop's production had fallen to 10,000 barrels a day, a fraction of what the Lucas well alone had produced. The wells were pulling up salt water. The shallow reserves in the caprock of the salt dome were being exhausted by the sheer density of drilling. By the end of 1902, there were 285 active wells crammed onto a space of a few hundred acres, and at the peak, you could have walked across portions of Spindletop Hill by stepping from one derrick platform to the next. They were packed so tightly. Photographs from that year show the hill forested with derricks, hundreds of wooden towers, each one the hope of someone's fortune, competing for the same shrinking reservoir beneath them. The hill that had produced more oil in a day than the rest of the world combined was, by most estimates, largely played out in less than 3 years. For nearly 2 decades afterward, Spindletop was considered a ghost field. But here's the thing about Beaumont. The Gusher was the event, but what it left behind was a city. An actual city, with an industrial base and a port and infrastructure that had nothing to do with the wells on the hill. The Spindletop discovery had also inspired wildcatting across the entire Gulf coastal plain. Prospectors swarming every suspicious rise and sulfur spring in southeast Texas, drilling on salt domes from the Louisiana border to the Brazos River. Significant new fields came in quick succession. Sour Lake in 1902, Saratoga in 1902, Batson Prairie in 1903, the Humble Field in 1905, Goose Creek in 1908. The region was becoming what it would remain for the rest of the century, an oil province. And Beaumont, at its eastern end, was the place where the infrastructure concentrated. The Neches River was channelized to Port Arthur in 1908, creating a deep-water shipping lane to the Gulf of Mexico. By 1916, the channel had been deepened to 25 feet, a turning basin dredged, and a shipyard constructed on an island in the river. Refineries lined the riverbanks, processing not just Spindletop crude, but oil from the neighboring fields that the Spindletop discovery had inspired. Sour Lake in 1902, Saratoga in 1902, Batson Prairie in 1903, the Humble Field in 1905. By 1925, Beaumont had approximately 135 manufacturing plants. The population, which had been 20,000 in 1910, reached 40,000 by 1920 and nearly 58,000 by 1930. Amid all of this, the people who had been rich before oil became spectacularly richer. W.P.H. McFadden, Perry McFadden as everyone called him, had been born in Beaumont in 1856 and had built a ranching empire with his father that at its peak encompassed about 160,000 acres across multiple Texas counties. The McFaddens also ran rice mills, canal and irrigation systems, and commercial real estate. Perry McFadden was vice president of the First National Bank of Beaumont. He'd bought the Crosby Hotel, the best-known lodging in town during the boom. And the land on which Anthony Lucas drilled the well that changed the world, the McFadden-Weiss-Kyle tract, was leased from his family's company. In 1907, Perry and his wife Ida moved into a 12,800 square foot Beaux-Arts Colonial Revival mansion at 1906 McFadden Avenue, in a neighborhood west of downtown that was quickly becoming known as Millionaire's Row. The house was designed by Henry Conrad Maurer, one of several architects who established practices in Beaumont within months of the Spindletop discovery. The McFaddens lived in that house for 75 years. The boom also attracted a less welcome element. So many fraudulent oil companies formed in the aftermath of Spindletop, selling worthless stock to credulous investors, that newspapers began calling the whole affair Swindletop. By January 1902, shares of certain Gladys-branded oil companies were trading for under a dime. Success magazine ran an expose calling some of them outright fraud. And Pattillo Higgins, the man who had started everything, found that the very city he had tried to enrich now regarded him with suspicion. When he attempted to form a new company in 1902, Beaumont residents, burned by the sharpsters and swindlers who had followed the boom, wouldn't trust him. Bitter, he packed up and left town. He sued Lucas and the Gladys City Company for royalties, arguing that Lucas's second lease had been executed before the first one expired and settled out of court. The lumber baron John Henry Kirby bought out his Higgins Oil and Fuel Company for $3 million. Higgins went on to a 50-year career prospecting for oil across Texas, but he never became the great tycoon he might have been. He had a peculiar habit of pulling out of ventures before they fully matured, leaving the biggest profits for others. Beaumont, meanwhile, was building itself a proper downtown. The wealth from oil, and more specifically, from refining, from shipping, from the industrial infrastructure that supported petroleum, produced a burst of civic construction in the 1920s that gave the city an architectural ambition beyond anything a town of its size might normally possess. In 1922, a group of 277 local investors pooled $1 million to build the Hotel Beaumont, an 11-story Mediterranean revival structure with 250 rooms, 2 ballrooms, and a rooftop sky room. It stood at the corner of Orlean and Fannin Streets and announced in limestone and terracotta that Beaumont considered itself a serious city. 5 years later, on November 14, 1927, the Jefferson Theater opened its doors on Fannin Street, right next door to the Hotel Beaumont. It cost another $1 million. Its architect was Emile Weil of New Orleans, who brought Canal Street sophistication to a Gulf Coast oil town. The exterior was dark orange brick framed in cast stone, with relief panels labeled Art and Music beneath a tiled hood. Inside, the style was Old Spanish and Renaissance Revival. Arched windows, a grand staircase in white marble, statuary in the alcoves, and a massive 3-manual, 8-rank Robert Morton pipe organ. with 778 pipes that rose on a hydraulic lift from the orchestra pit. The Jefferson seated 1,400. It would serve as Beaumont's premier entertainment venue for 4 decades. The 1920s were also, it should be noted, a darker time in some respects. The Ku Klux Klan gained significant power in Beaumont during this period, controlling local politics from roughly 1922 to 1924. Oil wealth does not ennoble a place any more than poverty degrades one. It simply amplifies what's already there, and what was already there in southeast Texas in the 1920s included the racial hierarchies and vigilante impulses of the Deep South. The grand theaters hosted elegant performances. The streets outside them were segregated. In 1928 came the Julie Rogers Theater, originally the city's civic auditorium, with its classical revival pillars, rococo cherubs floating in painted clouds on the ceiling, and seating for nearly 1,700. And in 1929, the Edson Hotel, 22 stories of classical revival limestone designed by the Steinman brothers of Beaumont at a cost of $1.5 million. It was the tallest building in southeast Texas. These were not buildings erected by wildcatters or speculators. They were built by a city that believed it was going to keep growing, and for a while it was right. Because in November 1925, almost exactly 25 years after the Lucas Gusher, the Hill delivered again. Mars McLean, who had first come to Beaumont as a boy during the 1901 boom and had developed a lifelong fascination with Spindletop, had studied law but come back to southeast Texas to truck farm on Bolivar Peninsula while nursing a theory that made geologists roll their eyes. He believed oil could be found on the flanks of the salt dome at greater depths. Most petroleum experts dismissed the idea. The caprock was depleted, and conventional wisdom held that salt dome flanks were barren. It was, in its way, the same argument Pattillo Higgins had made 30 years earlier, the self-taught outsider insisting he was right and the professionals were wrong. McLean held leases at Spindletop, and he found a partner in Miles F. Yunt, a driller and independent oilman who shared his hunch. Yunt had moved his Yunt Lee Oil Company from Sour Lake to Beaumont in 1923 and bought a magnificent mansion called El Ocaso on Calder Avenue, the street that was becoming known as Millionaire's Row. Their first well was a dry hole. Yunt, inexplicably but characteristically, declared after the failure that he was now more certain than ever that oil was there. On the evening of November 13, 1925, Yunt and McLean ran a flow test on their McFadden No. 2 well, drilled to about 5,400 feet on the southeast flank of the Spindletop Dome. Yunt had invited several friends and business associates to enjoy the party, as he modestly put it. The test came back a success. Oil was there, deep and plentiful, exactly where McLean had said it would be. The second boom was more controlled than the first, but still fierce. A single acre of Spindletop land sold for $200,000. By 1927, Spindletop reached its all-time annual production peak. 21 million barrels in a single year, more than even the frenzied first boom had produced. Over the next decade, more than 72 million barrels came out of the flank wells. And it was this second boom, more than the first, that paid for the grand buildings downtown. The Hotel Beaumont, the Jefferson Theater, the Edson Hotel, the Kyle Building in its sharp Art Deco zigzags, the Goodhue Building, the San Jacinto Life Building. These were the monuments of a city that had been given a second chance at the same miracle and was spending accordingly. Miles Yunt, to his credit, spent some of his money on the city itself. During the Great Depression, when Beaumont's municipal finances collapsed, Yunt Lee Oil Company lent the city enough money to make payroll, not once, but at least twice. Yunt died in 1933, and his company was later sold, but the debt Beaumont owed him was more than financial. He'd kept the lights on. What Beaumont became, in the decades after the second boom, was something steadier and less glamorous than either the frenzied boomtown of 1901 or the ambitious builder of the 1920s. It became a refinery city, a port city, a blue-collar industrial center where the Magnolia Refinery, later Mobil, later Exxon Mobil, employed thousands, where the shipyard on the island in the Neches turned out vessels for both world wars. That shipyard had been founded in 1917 as the Beaumont Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company, part of the emergency wartime program, building wooden cargo carriers from local pine for the Allied supply lines. Pennsylvania Car and Foundry bought the yard in 1922 and kept it busy through the lean interwar years building tankers, many of them for Texaco, the oil company that had been born in a Mud Street office on the other side of town. During the Second World War, the yard turned out minesweepers, cargo vessels, and dozens of ships for the merchant marine, and Beaumont's refineries ran at capacity, shipping fuel across the Atlantic and the Pacific. The population grew steadily to its peak of about 119,000 in 1960. Beaumont, Port Arthur, and Orange formed what people called the Golden Triangle, a petrochemical corridor that processed and shipped a significant portion of the nation's fuel. The port of Beaumont, fed by that deepened Neches Channel, would eventually become the fourth busiest port in the United States by cargo tonnage and the busiest military port in the world for processing American equipment. The Spindletop field itself wound down by 1936 and was shut in. From the 1950s through about 1975, the dome was mined for sulfur. The extraction of oil, brine, and sulfur caused the surface of the hill to subside, to sink, which is perhaps the most fitting geological metaphor for a place that had given up everything beneath it. A pink granite monument erected in 1941 near the original well site eventually had to be moved to the campus of Lamar University because the ground beneath it was no longer stable. Over 153 million barrels of oil had been drawn from Spindletop by 1985. The arc of Beaumont from the 1960s onward follows a pattern familiar to anyone who has watched American industrial cities age. The interstates came, I-10 slicing east-west through town, and with them the suburban sprawl that pulled residents and retail out of downtown. The grand buildings remained, but the life around them thinned. The department stores closed. The movie palaces went dark. Houston, 85 miles to the west, had grown into a global energy capital, absorbing the corporate headquarters and the white-collar jobs and the ambition that Beaumont's gusher had set in motion. The oil industry didn't abandon Beaumont. It's hard to move a 600,000-barrel-a-day refinery. But the prestige, the deal-making, the executive suites, the culture of oil as a world-shaping enterprise that migrated west, and Beaumont became the place where the physical work got done, rather than the place where the decisions got made. The Hotel Beaumont, built by 277 investors who believed in the future of their city, closed as a hotel and was converted into a retirement community in 1977. That, too, eventually closed, and the building was sold at auction in 2014. The Dixie Hotel on Crockett Street, which during the boom years had housed the notorious bordello of a madam named Rita Ainsworth, finally shuttered by a state commission in 1961, was reinvented as a dance hall. Crockett Street itself, the commercial spine of downtown, was rebranded as an entertainment district. The Jefferson Theater was restored in a multi-million-dollar renovation and still hosts concerts and classic movie nights, its Robert Morton organ still rising from the pit on its original hydraulic lift. The McFadden Ward House at 1906 McFadden Avenue, surrounded by 100-year-old live oaks, is a museum now, preserved exactly as the family left it, with the original furnishings and the quiet opulence of people who were wealthy before oil and wealthier after. The refineries still run. The Exxon Mobil Beaumont refinery, built on the banks of the Neches in 1903 as the Magnolia plant, is now the 11th largest refinery in the world, processing over 600,000 barrels a day. It employs roughly 2,000 people directly, with another 3,000 contractors. The petrochemical industry didn't leave Beaumont. It just stopped being enough to sustain a city in the way that a diverse economy sustains one. Beaumont's population has held remarkably steady since 1960, around 115,000 to 119,000 across 6 decades, which means it neither collapsed nor grew. It endured. That is a different kind of American story than the one about the boom, but it is no less real. Pattillo Higgins died on June 5, 1955, at 91 years old in San Antonio. He had never stopped looking for oil. When he was nearly 90, he was still driving out to remote tracks in his old Model A Ford, a pick and shovel in the back, poking at rocks and testing soil with the same stubborn certainty that had made him the prophet and the fool of Spindletop. He'd made a comfortable living in oil over the 50 years since the Lucas gusher, but comfortable is a long way from what the men who cut him out of the deal had made. Gulf Oil became one of the largest energy companies on the planet. Texaco sold gasoline in all 48 contiguous states by 1928. Humble Oil merged into what became Exxon. Pattillo Higgins got $3 million and a lifetime of prospecting. Among his papers after he died, they found a document dated December 3, 1901, less than a year after the gusher, signed by 32 citizens of Beaumont, attesting to his role in the discovery. The town that had mocked him and then mistrusted him had, at least on paper, acknowledged what he'd done. Whether he ever felt that was enough, nobody recorded. One more thing about Higgins, because it matters for understanding the kind of man he was. In 1905, at the age of 42, he adopted a 15-year-old orphan named Annie Johns and made her his sole heir. 3 years later, he married her. They had 3 children. The biographical record doesn't elaborate, and the distance of a century makes it impossible to know what to make of this. It's the kind of detail that doesn't fit neatly into the story of a visionary prophet, and so most accounts of Spindletop mention it briefly or not at all. But this script promised not to invent, and it promised not to skip. The companies Higgins's obsession helped create are no longer independent. Gulf Oil was absorbed by Chevron in 1985. Texaco was acquired by Chevron in 2001. Humble became Exxon, which merged with Mobil to form ExxonMobil. The red star of Texaco and the orange disc of Gulf Oil, which once stood on gas stations in every American town, are brand names now, owned by the same parent corporation, their Beaumont origins reduced to a line in a corporate history. The industry Spindletop launched, the industry that defined the 20th century, that built Houston and shaped the geopolitics of the Middle East and put 100 million cars on American roads. That industry was born in a lumber town on the Neches River, on pasture land leased from a cattle rancher, because a one-armed brickmaker wouldn't stop believing that the stinking hill where he took his Sunday school class for picnics was sitting on top of a fortune. Today, at the Spindletop Gladys City Boomtown Museum on the campus of Lamar University in Beaumont, you can see a 64-foot replica derrick built over the approximate site of the Lucas gusher. For $50 during regular museum hours, they will blow the gusher for you. A column of water, not oil, shooting up from the spot where, on a January morning 125 years ago, the earth opened up and poured out more wealth than anyone alive had ever imagined. The water plume lasts about 2 minutes. Then they shut it off, and it's quiet, and you're standing on a low rise in the Gulf Coast prairie in southeast Texas, surrounded by flat land and refinery towers on the horizon, and if you didn't know what happened here, you'd have no reason to stop.